They called her ruined. They said she deserved what she got. And when Mara Quinn walked into that rancher's house with nothing but a worn dress and a shattered heart, even he made it clear she could sleep under his roof, but she'd never belong there. "Stay away from the boy," he said. "Don't touch him. Don't speak to him. Don't even look at him." But some wounds recognize each other in the dark, and some broken people are the only ones who know how to heal each other. This is their story. Comment your city below so I can see how far it travels. The rain came down in sheets the day Mara Quinn arrived at the Boone Ranch, turning the dirt road into a slick ribbon of mud that clung to the wheels of the supply wagon and made every mile feel like 10. She sat in the back with her arms wrapped around herself, her traveling cloak soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. The driver hadn't spoken to her since they left Red Hollow. Not a word, not even a glance. She was cargo now, being delivered to a place that didn't want her. She didn't blame him. The entire town had watched her leave. Women had turned their backs. Men had muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Even the preacher had looked at her with something cold and final, like she was already dead and he was simply waiting for the burial. Mara had kept her head down and climbed into the wagon without a word because there was nothing left to say. She had already said it all 2 months ago, standing in the middle of the general store with her hands shaking and her voice breaking, trying to explain that she hadn't known, that he'd promised her, that she'd believed him. No one had cared. The man who'd done it, Garrett Hale, with his easy smile and his silver tongue, had been long gone by then. Vanished into the territory like smoke, leaving nothing behind but rumors and wreckage. And Mara, standing alone in the ruins of her own life, had learned a truth that women on the frontier learned young or not at all. The world didn't punish men for lying. It punished women for believing them. Her family had been the first to shut the door. Her father hadn't even looked at her when he said it. "You made your choice, girl. Now you live with it." Her mother had cried, but she hadn't fought him. Her brother had carried her things to the porch and left them there in the rain. By morning the door was locked, and Mara was gone. The town had offered her exactly one option: work for Silas Boone, a widower with a ranch 20 miles outside Red Hollow, a man who needed help and didn't ask questions. The arrangement had been made through the church, cold and transactional, room and board in exchange for labor, no promises beyond that. The committee had made it clear that this was charity, not kindness, a last chance she didn't deserve. Mara had taken it because there was nothing else to take. The wagon lurched over a rut, and she grabbed the side to steady herself, her fingers numb with cold. Through the rain, she could see the outline of the ranch beginning to take shape, a sturdy house with a slanted roof, a barn that looked like it had weathered 100 storms, a corral empty except for 2 horses standing with their heads low against the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney, gray and thin. Somewhere inside that house was the man who had agreed to let her stay, and somewhere inside was the boy she'd been told not to touch. The wagon stopped. The driver climbed down without a word, pulled her single bag from the back and set it on the ground. Then he tipped his hat to the figure standing in the doorway of the house and drove away, leaving Mara standing in the mud with the rain pouring down and nowhere left to run. Silas Boone stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and silent in the way that men who live alone too long become silent. His face was weathered, his jaw shadowed with a few days' growth of beard, his eyes the color of winter sky. He looked at her the way a man might look at a stray dog, wary, measuring, already deciding how much trouble she was going to be. "You Mara Quinn?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, sharp and final. "Come inside. You're dripping." She picked up her bag and followed him into the house, her boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace, a heavy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with tin plates and cups, a doorway leading to what looked like a small kitchen. Everything was functional. Nothing was soft. It was a house built for survival, not comfort. Silas gestured toward a narrow door at the back. "That's your room. Used to be storage. I cleared it out. There's a bed, a chest, a lamp. You'll share the well and the wash basin with me and the boy. Meals are at dawn and dusk. I don't waste food and I don't wait. If you're late, you eat cold." Mara nodded. "Understood. You'll help with the house, the garden, the chickens, the washing. I'll handle the cattle and the heavy work. You stay out of the barn unless I tell you otherwise." He paused, his eyes hard. "And you stay away from Eli." The words hit her like a slap. "Your son," she said quietly. "My son." Silas's jaw tightened. "He doesn't talk, doesn't like people, doesn't need anyone trying to fix him. You leave him be, that's the rule." Mara met his gaze and saw something buried beneath the hardness. Grief, old and deep, wrapped in barbed wire. She didn't push. She just nodded. "I understand." "Good." Silas turned toward the fire, his back to her. "Get settled. Supper's in an hour." Mara carried her bag to the small room and closed the door behind her. The space was barely big enough for the narrow bed and the wooden chest shoved against the wall, but it was dry and it was hers. She set her bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself breathe for the first time in hours. This was it. This was what her life had become. She pressed her hands to her face and felt the weight of everything she'd lost settle over her like a stone. That first night, Mara heard the boy. It was past midnight, the house dark and still, when the sound cut through the silence, a low, choked cry, muffled but unmistakable. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. It came again, sharper this time, breaking into something raw and desperate. She moved to the door and opened it quietly. The hallway was black except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. Across from her, a door stood slightly ajar. The sound was coming from inside. Mara hesitated. Stay away from Eli. That had been the rule. The only rule Silas had said with real weight behind it. But the sound of that boy crying alone in the dark was something she recognized too well. She knew what it felt like to lie awake and wait for someone to care, to hope that someone would come, and to learn, night after night, that no one ever would. She crossed the hallway and stopped just outside the door. "Eli?" Her voice was soft, careful. "It's Mara. I'm not going to come in. I just wanted you to know you're not alone." The crying stopped. Silence. Mara waited, her hand resting on the doorframe. She didn't move, didn't push. After a long moment, she spoke again. "I'm going to sit right here. If you need anything, I'm here." She lowered herself to the floor, her back against the wall, and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The wood was cold and hard, but she didn't move. She just sat there listening to the quiet, letting the boy know that someone had heard him. Inside the room, the silence stretched. But this time, it wasn't empty. Morning came gray and cold. Mara woke with her neck stiff and her body aching from sleeping on the floor. She stood slowly, glancing at Eli's door, still closed, and made her way to the kitchen. Silas was already there, standing by the stove with a pot of coffee in his hand. He looked at her without expression. "You sleep on the floor?" Mara didn't lie. "I heard Eli last night. I sat outside his door." Silas's jaw tightened. "I told you to stay away from him." "I didn't go in. I didn't touch him. I just sat there so he'd know someone heard him." "He doesn't need that." "Maybe not," Mara said quietly. "But I did it anyway." Silas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table in front of her. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes. Don't be late." He walked out, leaving Mara alone with the steam rising from the cup and the silence settling back into the house like dust. The days that followed were hard and lonely. Mara worked from dawn until dusk, feeding the chickens, hauling water, scrubbing laundry in the cold until her hands cracked and bled. Silas spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer it. They moved around each other like shadows, careful not to touch. But every night, she heard Eli, and every night she sat outside his door. She didn't speak much, just a few words to let him know she was there. Sometimes she hummed softly. Sometimes she just sat in the silence and breathed with him. She never opened the door, never asked him to come out. She simply existed in the space between his fear and the rest of the world, a quiet presence that asked for nothing. Slowly the crying began to change. It came less often. When it did come, it was softer, shorter. And one night, as Mara sat with her back against the wall, she heard something new, the faint creak of floorboards. The boy was moving closer to the door. She didn't react, didn't turn. She just kept humming the same low tune she'd been humming all week, letting it fill the space between them. The door opened an inch. Mara's heart tightened, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes forward, her voice steady. "Hi, Eli," she said softly. "I'm still here." The door didn't open further, but it didn't close either. By the end of the second week, Eli began appearing at mealtimes. He didn't sit at the table. He stood in the doorway, half hidden, watching. Mara didn't acknowledge him directly. She simply set a plate on the edge of the table, within reach, and went about her own meal. Silas watched it all with narrowed eyes, but said nothing. The first time Eli took the plate, Mara's chest ached with something she couldn't name. Progress. Hope. The beginning of trust. One morning, as Mara was hanging laundry on the line, she felt someone watching her. She turned and saw Eli standing at the corner of the house, his small frame tense, his dark eyes fixed on her. He was maybe 7 years old, thin and pale, with hair that hadn't been cut in months. He looked like a wild thing, ready to bolt at the first wrong move. Mara smiled gently and went back to hanging the shirts. After a moment, Eli stepped closer. Mara kept working, her movement slow and calm. "Morning, Eli. Cold today, isn't it?" He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. She finished the laundry and picked up the basket. When she turned, Eli was standing right there, close enough to touch. His eyes were wide and searching, like he was trying to figure out if she was safe. Mara crouched down slowly, meeting him at eye level. "You're a brave kid," she said softly. "Braver than you know." Eli stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached out and touched the edge of her sleeve. Just once. A single, tentative gesture that said more than 1,000 words ever could. Mara's throat tightened. She didn't move, didn't grab him, didn't cry. She just stayed very still and let him decide. And when he pulled his hand back and ran toward the house, she let him go. That night, Silas found her in the kitchen after supper, washing dishes in the basin. He stood in the doorway for a long time before he spoke. "He touched you today." Mara nodded. "Just my sleeve." "He hasn't done that since his mother died." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Mara kept her hands in the water, her voice quiet. "I'm not trying to replace her." "I know." Silas's voice was rough. "But he's starting to trust you, and I don't know if that's good or dangerous." Mara turned to face him. "Why would it be dangerous?" Silas looked at her with something close to pain. "Because people leave, and when they do, they take pieces of you with them." "I'm not leaving," Mara said firmly. "You don't know that." "Maybe not, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to hurt him." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and uncertain, and walked away. Winter deepened. The snow came in thick and relentless, burying the ranch in white silence. Mara and Eli fell into a rhythm. Mornings by the fire, quiet afternoons in the kitchen, evenings where he sat near her while she mended clothes or peeled potatoes. He still didn't speak, but he began to communicate in other ways. A tug on her sleeve meant he was hungry. A hand on her knee meant he wanted her to stay. A soft hum in return to her songs meant he felt safe. Silas watched it all from a distance, torn between relief and fear. One night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled low, Eli fell asleep with his head resting against Mara's shoulder. She didn't move. She just sat there, holding very still, her hand resting lightly on his back. Silas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "He used to do that with her," he said quietly. Mara looked up. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Silas's voice was thick. She'd be glad he's not alone anymore. He turned and walked back to his room, leaving Mara with the sleeping boy and the firelight flickering against the walls. By the time spring began to break through the snow, something in the house had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and slow, like ice melting under the sun. Eli smiled sometimes. He sat at the table now. He helped Mara with small tasks, holding the basket while she gathered eggs, handing her clothespins while she hung laundry, and Silas stopped pulling away. He started joining them for meals, started asking Mara questions, small ones, careful ones, started letting himself see her not as a burden or a risk, but as someone who had become part of the fabric of their days. One evening, as they sat together after supper, Eli climbed into Mara's lap and pressed his forehead against hers. It was the most affection he'd ever shown. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She just held him close and whispered, "You're safe. I promise." Silas watched from across the table, his throat tight, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be made whole again. The first time someone from town came to the ranch, Mara was in the garden pulling weeds. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the familiar creak and rattle of wheels on frozen ground. She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched as a woman in a dark bonnet climbed down and tied her horse to the post. It was Mrs. Calloway, the minister's wife, carrying a covered basket and wearing the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Calloway." "Mr. Boone." She nodded briskly, then turned her gaze to Mara. "And you must be the girl." Mara felt the words land like stones. Not her name, just the girl. She wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing. "I brought some preserves," Mrs. Calloway continued, holding up the basket. "Thought I'd check in, see how things are settling." "We're fine," Silas said flatly. "I'm sure you are." Mrs. Calloway's smile tightened. But the committee thought it wise to ensure the arrangement is working as intended. For the boy's sake, you understand. Mara's stomach twisted. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an inspection. Mrs. Calloway stepped past Silas and into the house without waiting for an invitation. Mara exchanged a glance with Silas, saw the flicker of irritation in his eyes, and followed them inside. Eli was sitting by the fire, a wooden horse in his hands. When Mrs. Calloway entered, he went very still. "Well, hello there, Eli," Mrs. Calloway said brightly, bending down as if speaking to a much younger child. "My, you've grown. Do you remember me?" Eli didn't move, didn't look at her. His fingers tightened around the toy. "He doesn't talk to strangers," Silas said, his tone edged with warning. "Yes, I'm aware of his condition." Mrs. Calloway straightened, brushing her skirt. "It's precisely why I wanted to see how Miss Quinn is managing. A child like this requires special care, patience, experience." "She has both," Silas said. Mrs. Calloway's eyes flicked to Mara, cool and measuring. "Does she now? And how would you know that, Mr. Boone? You've only had her here a few weeks." "I know because I see him every day," Silas said evenly, "and he's better than he's been in 2 years. Mrs. Calloway's smile didn't waver, but something hard moved behind it. "I'm glad to hear it. Though I hope you understand that the town has a responsibility to ensure this arrangement doesn't cause harm. There are concerns, Mr. Boone, about propriety, about influence." Her gaze settled on Mara, about the kind of example being set. Mara felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm here to help. That's all." "Of course," Mrs. Calloway said smoothly, "but you must understand how it looks. A young woman of questionable character living under the same roof as a widower and his vulnerable child. People talk." "Let them talk," Silas said, his voice cold as iron. Mrs. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Boone, I don't think you appreciate the delicacy of the situation. The committee extended charity to this girl when no one else would. But charity comes with conditions. If there's even a whisper of impropriety, they won't hesitate to remove her." "She's staying," Silas said. "That remains to be seen." Mrs. Calloway picked up her basket and moved toward the door. "I'll be reporting back to the committee. I suggest you both remember who holds the authority here." She left without another word, the door swinging shut behind her. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Mara stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Eli had curled into himself, the toy horse abandoned on the floor. Silas walked to the window and watched the wagon pull away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Don't let her get to you." "She's going to take me away," Mara said quietly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "You heard her. They're looking for reasons, and they'll find them whether they're real or not." Silas turned to face her, his jaw set. "Then we don't give them any." Mara wanted to believe him, but she'd learned long ago that belief wasn't enough to stop the world from breaking you. That night, Eli's nightmares returned. Mara heard him from across the hall, the muffled sounds of distress cutting through the dark. She rose immediately and crossed to his door, her heart pounding. Inside, she could hear him thrashing, his breathing sharp and uneven. "Eli, it's Mara," she said softly, pushing the door open just enough to see him. He was tangled in the blankets, his small body rigid with fear. She moved to the bed and sat down on the edge, her hand hovering above his shoulder. "You're safe. I'm here." His eyes opened, wild and unfocused. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then, slowly, the panic began to fade. He reached for her, his fingers clutching at her sleeve, and Mara gathered him into her arms without hesitation. "It's all right," she whispered, rocking him gently. "You're all right. I've got you." He pressed his face against her shoulder and shook silently, his whole body trembling. Mara held him close, her hand moving in slow circles on his back, and murmured quiet reassurances until the trembling stopped. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. "Better?" she asked. He nodded, a small, fragile movement. "Do you want me to stay?" Another nod. Mara shifted so she could sit against the headboard, and Eli curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead and began to hum the same tune she'd hummed the first night she sat outside his door. Slowly, his breathing evened out. His body relaxed, and within minutes, he was asleep. Mara stayed there the rest of the night, her back aching and her legs numb, because leaving him alone in the dark felt like a betrayal she couldn't stomach. When dawn broke and she finally eased herself out of the bed, Silas was standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, then at his son, and something in his expression cracked open. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mara nodded, too tired for words, and slipped past him into the hallway. The second visit came a week later. This time it was two men from the town council, Mr. Brennan, the mayor, and Mr. Sutton, who owned the general store. They arrived at midday, their faces stern and their purpose clear. Silas met them at the gate, his arms crossed. "Gentlemen?" "Mr. Boone," Brennan said, tipping his hat. "We need to have a conversation, in private." Silas glanced back at the house, where Mara stood on the porch with Eli beside her. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Sutton shifted uncomfortably. "This is a sensitive matter, Boone. Best handled without an audience." "She stays," Silas said. Brennan sighed. "Fine, have it your way." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Silas. "The committee has received complaints, multiple complaints, about the living situation here." Silas unfolded the paper and scanned it, his jaw tightening. "What kind of complaints?" "Concerns about the moral environment," Brennan said carefully. "Concerns about the boy being exposed to influences that may not be appropriate for a child of his age and condition." "Influences," Silas repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You mean Mara?" "She has a history, Boone," Sutton said bluntly. "A history that raises questions, and people are worried." "Worried about what exactly?" Silas's eyes were cold. "That she'll teach my son to be kind? That she'll show him what it looks like when someone actually gives a damn?" "That's not fair," Brennan said. "We're trying to protect the boy." "From what? From someone who sits with him when he has nightmares? From someone who makes sure he eats and sleeps and feels safe for the first time since his mother died?" Silas's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You want to protect him? Then get off my land and leave us the hell alone." Brennan's face hardened. "We have the authority to intervene if we believe a child is at risk." "Then you'd better be damn sure he's at risk," Silas said, "because if you try to take him or her, you'll have a fight on your hands." Sutton stepped forward. "Be reasonable, Boone. We're not trying to make this difficult, but if you won't cooperate, the committee can escalate this to the territorial court, and you won't win that fight." Silas stared at them both, his fists clenched at his sides. Then very slowly, he handed the paper back. "You tell the committee that if they want to come after me, they're welcome to try. But they're going to need more than rumors and moral indignation." Brennan took the paper, his expression grim. "We'll see what the committee says." They left without another word, and Silas stood there watching them go, his chest heaving with barely controlled rage. Mara came down from the porch, Eli's hand in hers. "What did they say?" she asked quietly. They're looking for a reason to take you away, Silas said, and they're not going to stop until they find one. Mara's throat tightened. Maybe I should go, before this gets worse. No. Silas turned to face her, his eyes fierce. You're not going anywhere. This is your home now, and I'm not letting them take that from you. Silas, I mean it, Mara. His voice softened just a fraction. You're part of this family, and I don't give up on family. Mara looked at him, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, hope, fear. All of it tangled together until she couldn't tell where one feeling ended and another began. Eli tugged on her hand, and when she looked down, he was holding up 3 fingers, their sign for together. Mara's eyes filled with tears. She knelt down and pulled him close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. Together, she whispered. The days grew longer as spring took hold. The snow melted into streams that ran through the fields, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Mara worked alongside Silas in the garden, planting seeds and mending fences, while Eli played nearby with his wooden animals. It felt almost normal, almost peaceful. But the town didn't forget. Every week, someone came by. Mrs. Calloway with her baskets and her pointed questions, Brennan with his paperwork and his veiled threats, even the doctor, under the pretense of checking on Eli's health, though everyone knew he was there to observe and report back. Each visit left Mara feeling more exposed, more fragile, like she was walking on ice that could crack at any moment. Silas tried to shield her from the worst of it, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. The lines around his eyes deepened. His shoulders grew tighter. He stopped sleeping well, spending nights pacing the porch or staring into the fire. One evening, as they sat together after supper, Mara finally broke the silence. You don't have to fight this hard, she said quietly. I'm not worth losing everything over. Silas looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Don't say that. It's true. You have Eli to think about. If the committee decides to escalate this, you could lose him, and that's not a risk you should take for me. You think I'm doing this for you? Silas's voice was rough. I'm doing this because it's right, because what they're doing to you is wrong, and because if I let them get away with it, I'm no better than they are. Mara's throat tightened. I just don't want you to regret it. The only thing I'd regret is letting you walk out that door and never coming back. Silas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady. You belong here, Mara. With us. And I'm not letting anyone take that away. Mara didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, her heart too full for words. Boy, It was Eli who changed everything. One afternoon, while Mara was hanging laundry and Silas was in the barn, Eli came running from the house with something clutched in his hand. He stopped in front of Mara, breathing hard, and held it out. It was a small folded piece of paper. Mara took it carefully and unfolded it. Inside, drawn in shaky, uneven lines, was a picture. 3 figures standing together. A tall man, a woman, and a small boy. Above them, Eli had drawn a simple house with smoke coming from the chimney. Mara's vision blurred. Eli, he pointed to the figures, then to himself, then to her, then to the barn where Silas was working. His meaning was clear. Family. Mara knelt down and pulled him into her arms, her tears spilling over. Yes, she whispered. Yes, sweetheart. That's us. That's our family. Eli hugged her tightly, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, Mara let herself believe that maybe she really did belong. That night, she showed the drawing to Silas. He stood in the kitchen holding it, his calloused fingers gentle against the paper. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he set it down on the table and looked at Mara, his eyes raw with emotion. He's never drawn anything before, Silas said hoarsely. Not since she died. He wanted you to see it, Mara said softly. Silas nodded, his jaw working. Then he did something Mara didn't expect. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we face it together. Mara squeezed his hand, her heart pounding. Together, Mara. The storm broke 3 days later. It started with a letter delivered by courier, sealed with the official stamp of the territorial court. Silas opened it at the kitchen table while Mara and Eli watched. His face darkened as he read. "What is it?" Mara asked. "They're calling a public hearing," Silas said, his voice tight. "Next week, to determine whether this household is a suitable environment for Eli." Mara's blood ran cold. "They're going to take him." "They're going to try." Silas crumpled the letter in his fist. "But they'll have to go through me first. Silas, you can't fight the court. Watch me." Mara wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Eli, about everything they'd built together, and Silas wasn't going to let it go without a fight. That night, as Mara lay awake staring at the ceiling, she heard footsteps in the hall. A moment later, Eli slipped into her room and climbed into bed beside her without a word. She wrapped her arms around him and held him close, her tears soaking into his hair. "I won't let them take you," she whispered. "I promise." But even as she said it, she knew that some promises were impossible to keep. The week leading up to the hearing was the longest of Mara's life. Silas spent his days preparing, riding into town to speak with anyone who might stand with them, writing letters, gathering proof that Eli was thriving. Mara threw herself into work, scrubbing the house until it gleamed, baking bread and mending clothes, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. Eli stayed close to both of them, his small face serious and watchful. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood enough. He understood that people were trying to break them apart. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Eli climbed into Mara's lap and pressed his forehead to hers. Then he took her hand and placed it over his heart. The gesture was so simple, so pure, that Mara's breath caught. "I feel it too," she whispered. "You're part of my heart now." Silas watched them from across the room, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and walked over, kneeling down beside them. He placed his hand over both of theirs, covering them completely. "We're going to win this," he said quietly. "I don't care what it takes." Mara looked at him, at the fierce determination in his eyes, and for the first time in days, she let herself hope. The night before the hearing, Mara couldn't sleep. She stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, staring out at the dark expanse of land stretching endlessly before her. The stars were bright and cold, indifferent to the chaos below. She heard the door open behind her and turned to see Silas stepping out. He joined her at the railing, his presence solid and steady. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you." They stood in silence for a moment, the night wrapping around them. Then Silas spoke, his voice low and rough. "I need you to know something," he said. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you gave us something I didn't think we'd ever have again. You gave Eli hope. You gave me hope. And that matters more than anything they can take from us." Mara turned to face him, her throat tight. "You gave me something too. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to keep going." Silas reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Then let's fight for it." Mara nodded, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Together. Together." They stood there under the stars, two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage and made a silent promise to hold on no matter what the morning brought. The morning came too soon. Mara woke before dawn, her body stiff from restless sleep, and dressed in the only good dress she owned, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Her hands shook as she fastened the buttons. Across the hall, she could hear Silas moving around, the creak of floorboards and the quiet sounds of a man preparing for battle. When she stepped into the kitchen, Eli was already awake, sitting at the table with his wooden horse clutched in both hands. He looked up at her with eyes too old for his face, and Mara felt her heart crack. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly. He climbed down from the chair and walked into her arms. She held him close, breathing in the smell of soap and sleep, and tried to memorize the feeling of his small body against hers. If this was the last time, she wanted to remember everything. "Whatever happens today," she whispered into his hair, "you remember that you are loved, you are safe, and you are strong." Eli pulled back and looked up at her. Then he pressed his hand flat against her chest, right over her heart. Their sign for here, for home. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Yes, you're here, always." Silas appeared in the doorway, dressed in his cleanest shirt and worn coat, his hair still damp from washing. He looked at them both, his face set and grim. "It's time," he said. They rode into Red Hollow in the wagon, the three of them sitting close together on the narrow bench. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered. The town appeared slowly through the gray morning light, weathered buildings, muddy streets, faces turning to watch as they passed. Mara felt the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every judgment being passed before they'd even spoken a word. The hearing was being held in the meeting hall, a squat wooden building at the center of town that served as courthouse, assembly room, and social hall depending on the occasion. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered outside. Women in their Sunday clothes, men with arms crossed, children darting between legs and skirts. They all turned to stare as Silas helped Mara down from the wagon. "Keep your head up," Silas murmured. "Don't give them the satisfaction." Mara straightened her shoulders and took Eli's hand. Together, the three of them walked through the crowd and into the building. Inside, the room had been arranged like a courtroom. A long table at the front where the committee members sat, chairs lined up in rows facing them, and a single wooden chair set apart in the center, the seat for the accused. Mara's stomach churned as she took in the faces at the table. Mayor Brennan, Mrs. Calloway, Sutton from the general store, and two others she didn't recognize, all of them watching her with expressions ranging from pity to outright contempt. "Mr. Boone, Miss Quinn," Brennan said, standing, "please take your seat." Silas guided Mara to the front row and sat beside her, Eli between them. The boy was silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hand gripping Mara's so tightly it hurt. Behind them, the room filled with townspeople, their murmurs rising and falling like a tide. Brennan called the room to order with a sharp knock on the table. "We are here today to address concerns regarding the welfare of Eli Boone, minor child of Silas Boone, and the suitability of his current living situation. This is not a trial, but a formal inquiry to determine what is in the best interest of the child." Mara felt the words settle over her like a shroud. Not a trial, but it felt like one. It felt like every trial she'd already faced in this town, every condemnation she'd already endured, condensed into a single moment. Mrs. Calloway leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Mr. Boone, we appreciate you coming today. We want to be clear that our concern is solely for Eli's well-being. We understand you hired Miss Quinn to assist with household duties. Can you tell us how that arrangement came about?" Silas's jaw tightened. "The committee arranged it. You know that." "Yes, but we'd like to hear your perspective," Brennan said smoothly. "What made you agree to take her in?" "I needed help," Silas said flatly. "I was offered help. I took it." "And you were aware of Miss Quinn's history?" "I was told she needed a place to stay and work to do. That's all I needed to know." Mrs. Calloway's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "And in the months she's been with you, have you observed any behaviors that concern you? Any indication that her influence might be detrimental to Eli?" "No." "No concerns at all?" "None." Sutton cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, with all respect, your son is a vulnerable child. He doesn't speak. He doesn't interact with others. How can you be certain that Miss Quinn is providing the kind of care he needs?" Silas turned to look at Sutton, his gaze hard. "Because I see him every day. I see him eat. I see him sleep. I see him smile. And I haven't seen that in 2 years." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Mrs. Calloway raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Boone, we don't doubt your love for your son, but love doesn't always mean we see things clearly. We have reports that Miss Quinn has been spending nights in Eli's room, alone, behind closed doors." Mara's face burned. She opened her mouth to speak, but Silas's hand shot out and gripped her wrist, a silent command to stay quiet. "She sits with him when he has nightmares," Silas said, his voice like gravel. "She comforts him. There's nothing improper about it." "Perhaps not in your eyes," Mrs. Calloway said. "But appearances matter, Mr. Boone. And the appearance of a young unmarried woman spending nights in a child's bedroom raises questions, uncomfortable questions." "Then ask them," Silas said sharply. "Stop dancing around it and say what you mean." Brennan shifted in his seat. "Mr. Boone, please. We're trying to handle this delicately." There's nothing delicate about what you're doing, Silas shot back. You're trying to destroy a woman's reputation and take my son away, and you're doing it under the guise of concern. So stop pretending and get to the point. The room went silent. Brennan's face darkened, but before he could respond, Mrs. Calloway spoke again, her voice clipped and precise. Very well. Miss Quinn, would you please stand? Mara's heart pounded. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and faced the committee. Miss Quinn, Mrs. Calloway said, you came to this town under unfortunate circumstances. You were taken in by a man who made promises he didn't keep, and you were left in a position of shame and destitution. The committee, in its mercy, arranged for you to work for Mr. Boone as an act of charity. Do you dispute any of that? Mara's throat was dry. No, ma'am. And do you believe you are a suitable influence for a young, impressionable child? Mara met her eyes, refusing to look away. I believe I care for Eli with everything I have. I believe he is safe with me, and I believe he knows he is loved. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer that matters. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Calloway's lips thinned. Miss Quinn, your defiance does you no credit. We are trying to determine whether you are fit to remain in that household. Your past actions suggest poor judgment. Your current behavior raises serious questions about propriety. Can you honestly say that you are the kind of woman who should be raising a child? Mara felt the words hit her like a fist. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to run. But then she felt Eli's hand slip into hers, small and warm and trusting, and something inside her hardened into steel. I can say, Mara began, her voice shaking but steady, that I was lied to by a man who saw me as something to use and discard. I can say that I believed him because I was taught to trust, to hope, to see the good in people. And I can say that when he left, this town decided I was the one who deserved punishment. Not him, me. The room was absolutely silent now. Mara took a breath and continued, her words gaining strength. You want to know if I'm fit to care for Eli? I'm the one who sits with him when he's afraid. I'm the one who makes sure he eats, that he's warm, that he knows someone is listening even when he can't speak. I don't have a spotless past. I don't have a perfect reputation, but I have a heart that knows what it means to be abandoned, and I will never, ever let that boy feel what I felt. Mrs. Calloway's face was tight with anger. You speak of abandonment, but what you describe is consequence. You made a choice, Miss Quinn, a poor one. And choices have results. And what choice did I make exactly? Mara's voice rose, sharp and clear. Believing a man who promised me a future? Trusting someone who lied to my face? Tell me, Mrs. Calloway, what choice did I have when he left and you all decided I was worthless? I could have what? Mara cut her off. Disappeared? Died quietly? Made it easier for all of you to forget I existed? I didn't have choices. I had one option, survive. And that's what I did. I survived. And now you want to punish me for it. The room erupted, voices overlapping, people standing, the committee members calling for order. Brennan slammed his hand on the table. Enough, Miss Quinn, sit down. Mara didn't move. No. Excuse me? I said no. Mara's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. You don't get to tell me to sit down and be quiet anymore. You don't get to decide my worth. I know what I am. I know what I've done. And I know what I'm doing now. I'm taking care of a child who needs me. I'm building a life that matters. And if that threatens you, if that makes you uncomfortable, then that's your problem, not mine. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Silas stood. He moved to stand beside Mara, his presence solid and unwavering. She's right, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. You want to sit here and judge her for surviving? For trying to build something good out of something broken? Then you're going to have to judge me too, because I'm the one who let her into my home. I'm the one who saw what she could do for my son. And I'm the one who's telling you now that if you take her away, you're not protecting Eli. You're destroying him. Brennan stood, his face red. Mr. Boone, I understand you're emotional, but I'm not emotional, Silas said coldly. I'm clear. Clearer than I've been in years. You want to talk about what's best for Eli? He's thriving. He eats, he sleeps, he's starting to trust again. And that's because of her, not because of you, not because of your charity or your concern, because of Mara. Mrs. Calloway rose to her feet. Mr. Boone, you cannot possibly believe that this woman, with her background, is the appropriate person to— Her background? Silas's voice cracked like a whip. Her background is that she was betrayed by a man who walked away without consequence while you all lined up to bury her. Her background is that she's stronger than anyone in this room because she's still standing. And her background is that she's the only person who's ever made my son feel safe again. So yes, I believe she's appropriate. I believe she's exactly who we need. The room was in chaos now, voices rising, people shouting, the committee trying to regain control. And then cutting through it all, a sound that stopped everything. Eli's voice. It was small and rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Safe. Every head turned. Eli was standing between Mara and Silas, his small face pale but determined. He looked up at Mara and repeated the word, louder this time. Safe. Mara's knees nearly gave out. She dropped down in front of him, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. Eli. He pressed his forehead to hers, the way he always did, and then turned to face the room. He pointed at Mara, then at himself, then made the sign they'd created together, 3 fingers, held up for everyone to see. Together. Silas's eyes were wet. He placed his hand on Eli's shoulder and looked at the committee, his voice rough with emotion. You wanted to know if she's good for him? You just got your answer. Brennan sank back into his chair, his face pale. Mrs. Calloway looked like she'd been struck. Sutton stared at Eli with his mouth open. The room had gone completely still. Then, from somewhere in the back, a woman's voice broke the silence. The boy spoke. Another voice joined in. He spoke for her. More voices, murmuring, whispering, the tide beginning to shift. Mara held Eli close, her tears falling freely now, and felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, strong and steady. Brennan cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. This changes things. We'll need to deliberate. No, Silas said firmly. You don't need to deliberate. You need to leave us alone. My son just told you everything you need to know. She stays. End of discussion. Mrs. Calloway's hands were clenched on the table. Mr. Boone, the committee still has the authority. Then use it, Silas said, his voice like iron. Take us to court. Put it in front of a judge. Let the whole territory hear how you tried to tear apart a family because a woman had the audacity to survive. See how that goes for you. Brennan and Mrs. Calloway exchanged a long look. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then Brennan stood, his movement stiff and reluctant. We will take the matter under advisement, he said carefully, and reconvene at a later date. No, Silas repeated. You'll make a decision now. Mr. Boone, now. The room held its breath. Brennan looked at the other committee members, then back at Silas. Finally, with visible reluctance, he nodded. Very well. Given the testimony we've heard today and the clear bond between the child and Miss Quinn, the committee will recommend that the current living arrangement continue, pending periodic reviews. No reviews, Silas said. Brennan's jaw tightened. Mr. Boone, we cannot simply abandon our oversight. You can and you will, because if you set foot on my property again without a court order, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Are we clear? Brennan's face flushed red, but he nodded stiffly. Clear. Silas took Mara's hand and pulled her to her feet, then lifted Eli into his arms. Together they walked out of the meeting hall and into the gray morning light. Behind them, the crowd parted in silence, watching as they climbed into the wagon and drove away. No one followed. No one spoke. They had won. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the 3 of them sitting close together as the wagon rattled over the uneven road. Eli had fallen asleep against Mara's shoulder, exhausted from the morning's ordeal. Silas held the reins loosely, his eyes on the horizon, his face unreadable. Finally, Mara broke the silence. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You could have lost everything. Silas glanced at her, his expression softening. I would have lost everything if I'd let them take you. Mara's throat tightened. Why? Why fight so hard for me? Silas was quiet for a long moment.
Then he pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her, his eyes steady and clear. "Because you're part of us now," he said simply. "Because Eli needs you. Because I—" He paused, his voice roughening. "Because I need you, and I'm done pretending I don't." Mara stared at him, her heart pounding. "Silas, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not trying to put pressure on you. I just need you to know that you're not here out of charity or obligation. You're here because you belong here. With us. And nothing the town says or does is going to change that." Mara's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I belong here," she whispered. "I know that now." Silas nodded, his own eyes bright. Then he clicked the reins and the wagon started moving again, carrying them home through the soft spring rain that had finally begun to fall. When they reached the ranch, Silas carried Eli inside and laid him on his bed, pulling the blanket up over his small, sleeping form. Mara stood in the doorway watching, her heart so full it ached. "He spoke," she said softly. "He actually spoke." "Because of you," Silas said. "Because you made him feel safe enough to try." "We made him feel safe," Mara corrected. "All of us together." Silas turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he couldn't say. Gratitude, respect, something deeper and more fragile that neither of them was ready to name. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For not giving up, for fighting, for being brave when I know you were terrified." "I was terrified," Mara admitted, "but I wasn't alone. And that made all the difference." Silas reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. The touch was so tender it made her breath catch. For a moment they just stood there, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. Then Silas stepped back, clearing his throat. "You should rest. It's been a long day." Mara nodded, though she didn't want to move. She wanted to stay in this moment, suspended between what was and what might be. But she knew they both needed time. Time to process. Time to breathe. She went to her room and lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was racing, replaying every moment of the hearing, every word spoken, every look exchanged. She had stood up for herself, she had fought back, and she had won. But more than that, she had found something she'd thought was lost forever. A family. A home. A place where she was wanted, needed, loved. As the afternoon light faded and evening settled over the ranch, Mara finally let herself relax. She could hear Silas moving around in the other room, the familiar sounds of their life together. And for the first time since the day she'd arrived, broken and desperate and alone, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in months. She felt hope. The days following the hearing passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The ranch settled back into its rhythms, morning chores, meals shared at the scarred wooden table, evenings by the fire. But something fundamental had shifted. The air felt lighter. The silences were no longer heavy with dread but peaceful, almost companionable. And Eli, who had spoken one single word in that crowded room, began to speak more. Not in sentences, not in long conversations, but in small, careful utterances that arrived like gifts. Hungry when he wanted food, cold when he needed his coat. Mara, when he woke from a nightmare and needed her close. Each word was a small miracle, and Mara treasured everyone. Silas watched his son's transformation with something close to wonder. He would catch himself staring as Eli sat with Mara in the kitchen, pointing at objects and waiting for her to name them, then repeating the words in his halting, rusty voice. Once, Silas found himself standing in the doorway for a full 10 minutes, just listening to the sound of his son's laughter, real laughter, bright and unguarded, as Mara tickled him during a game they'd invented with the wooden animals. "You're staring," Mara said without looking up, though there was a smile in her voice. "Can't help it," Silas admitted. "I'd forgotten what he sounded like." Mara glanced at him then, her expression soft. "He's finding his way back." "We all are," Silas said quietly. 3 weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived. Mara was hanging washing when she saw the rider approach. A young man she didn't recognize carrying an official-looking envelope. Her stomach clenched with old fear,
But Silas took the letter calmly and dismissed the writer with a nod. He opened it standing on the porch, his face unreadable as he scanned the contents. "What is it?" Mara asked, her voice tight. Silas looked up, and to her surprise there was the faintest hint of a smile on his face. "It's from the territorial court. They've dismissed any further inquiries into our household. The committee's authority has been officially revoked in matters concerning Eli. They can't touch us anymore." Mara's knees went weak. "It's over?" "It's over." She pressed her hand to her mouth, relief washing over her so strongly she had to sit down on the porch steps. Silas sat beside her, the letter still in his hand. "They didn't want the scandal," he said. "A public hearing is one thing. Pursuing it through the courts when a child spoke in your defense, that's another. They backed down." "Thank heavens," Mara whispered. "Thank yourself," Silas said. "You're the one who stood up to them. You're the one who fought." Mara looked at him, this man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go, who had defended her when the world turned against her, who had become something she hadn't dared to hope for. "I couldn't have done it without you." "We did it together," Silas said. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "That's what family does." The words settled between them, solid and real. Family. Not an arrangement, not charity. Family. Eli came running from the barn then, his face flushed with excitement, and threw himself into Mara's lap. "Bird," he said breathlessly, pointing toward the sky. "Big bird." "A hawk," Mara said, following his gaze. "See how it circles?" "Hawk," Eli repeated, his eyes wide with wonder. Silas watched them, his chest tight with an emotion he could barely name. Gratitude. Joy. Something deeper and more complicated that he wasn't quite ready to examine. But it was there, growing stronger every day, and he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Silas and Mara sat together on the porch. The spring air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of new grass and distant rain. Stars scattered across the sky like scattered seed. "I've been thinking," Silas said after a long silence, "about the future." Mara turned to look at him, her expression guarded. "What about it?" "About what happens next. With us. With this." He gestured vaguely at the house, the land, the life they'd built. "I know we started this as an arrangement, a transaction, but it's not that anymore. It hasn't been for a while." Mara's heart began to race. "No, it hasn't." Silas took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not good at this. Talking about feelings. My wife used to say I had all the romantic instinct of a fence post." He smiled faintly at the memory. "But I need you to know that you're not just help to me. You're not just someone who takes care of Eli. You're important. To both of us. And I don't want you to ever feel like you have to leave." "I don't want to leave," Mara said softly. "Good." Silas looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of work. "Because I want you to stay. Not as hired help, not as someone doing me a favor, but as someone who belongs here permanently." Mara's breath caught. "Silas, what are you saying?" He looked at her then, his eyes clear and steady. "I'm saying that I care about you, more than I thought I could care about anyone after losing her. I'm saying that when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it. And I'm saying that if you're willing, I'd like to make this official, make you part of this family in every way that matters." Mara stared at him, her mind racing. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to think about it," Silas said carefully. "I know it's complicated. I know you've been through hell, and you might not be ready for something like this. But I wanted you to know where I stand, where my heart is." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Silas, She paused, struggling to find the words. "I never thought I'd have this. A home. A family. Someone who sees me as more than what happened to me. You've given me all of that. You and Eli both. Is that a yes?" I need time," Mara said gently. "Not because I don't care about you. I do, more than I know how to say. But I need to be sure that I'm doing this for the right reasons, that I'm not just grabbing onto safety because I'm afraid of being alone again." Silas nodded, though she could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Mara reached over and took his hand. Thank you for asking, for caring, for seeing me as someone worth asking. You're worth everything, Silas said quietly. They sat there in the darkness, hands linked, neither speaking, just being present with each other, and the enormity of what had been offered and what had been promised to be considered. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal. The next morning brought unexpected news. Mara was kneading bread dough when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, squinting against the morning sun. The wagon was unfamiliar, driven by a man in a marshal's uniform. Her stomach dropped. Silas emerged from the barn, his expression wary. Can I help you? The marshal climbed down, tipping his hat. Marshal Hewitt, out of Cheyenne. I'm looking for a Miss Mara Quinn. Mara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. I'm Mara Quinn. The marshal studied her for a moment, then pulled a folded paper from his coat. I have news regarding Garrett Hale. The name hit her like a physical blow. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. Silas was at her side immediately, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. What about him? Silas asked, his voice hard. He's been arrested, the marshal said. 3 counties over. Caught running the same scheme on another woman, but this time there was a witness, a shopkeeper who heard him making promises he had no intention of keeping. The woman filed charges. When we brought him in, we found evidence of at least 6 other women he'd done this to over the past 3 years. Mara's legs felt weak. 6? At least. Could be more. The marshal's expression softened. The prosecutor wants to know if you'd be willing to testify. Your testimony could help put him away for a long time. Mara stared at him, her mind reeling. Garrett, in custody, facing justice. It felt surreal, impossible. For so long, she'd believed he was untouchable, that men like him always got away with it while women like her paid the price. What happens if I testify? She asked. You'd have to travel to Cheyenne for the trial. Give your account of what happened. It won't be easy. His lawyer will try to discredit you, make it seem like you were complicit. But the prosecutor believes that with multiple victims coming forward, he won't be able to charm his way out of this one. Silas's grip on her arm tightened. She doesn't have to do anything she doesn't want to do. I know, the marshal said, but justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure he can't do this to anyone else. And right now, Miss Quinn's testimony could be the difference between him walking free and him spending the next decade behind bars. Mara looked at Silas, then back at the marshal. Her hands were shaking. The thought of facing Garrett again, of standing in a courtroom and reliving the worst moments of her life, made her want to run. But the thought of him doing to someone else what he'd done to her, of another woman standing alone in a town square while people whispered and judged, made her angry. I'll do it, she said. Mara, Silas started. I'll do it, she repeated, stronger this time. He needs to answer for what he did, not just to me, to all of us. The marshal nodded approvingly. The trial is set for 2 weeks from now. I'll send word with the details. And Miss Quinn, thank you. What you're doing takes courage. After he left, Mara stood in the yard staring at the dust settling in the wagon's wake. Silas stood beside her, silent and solid. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Yes, I do. It's going to be hard. They're going to try to tear you apart. Let them try. Mara turned to face him, her eyes fierce. I'm not the same person I was when I came here. I'm not scared and broken and ashamed anymore. I know my worth now, and I'm not going to let him or anyone else take that away from me. Silas looked at her with something close to awe. You're the strongest person I've ever met. I learned from the best, Mara said, managing a small smile. The 2 weeks before the trial passed in a blur. Mara threw herself into work, trying not to think too much about what was coming. Silas helped her prepare, sitting with her in the evenings and asking her the kinds of questions she might face, helping her practice telling her story without falling apart. It was brutal, reliving those memories, but he stayed with her through every moment, never judging, never turning away. Eli sensed something was wrong. He stayed close to Mara, his small hand often finding hers, his worried eyes following her around the house. One night, as she tucked him into bed, he touched her face and said, Sad? Mara's throat tightened. A little bit, sweetheart, but I'm okay. Stay?
he asked. Always, she promised. I'm not going anywhere. Safe, Eli said, pressing his hand to her heart. Mara held him close, drawing strength from his trust. Yes, baby. Safe. The morning she left for Cheyenne, the sky was gray and heavy with the threat of rain. Silas loaded her small bag into the wagon and helped her up onto the seat. Eli stood on the porch, his face pale and anxious. I'll be back in 3 days, Mara called to him. I promise. Eli nodded, but his eyes were wet. Silas climbed up beside her and took the reins. I'm coming with you. You don't have to. I'm coming with you, Silas repeated firmly. You're not doing this alone. Mara's eyes filled with tears. What about Eli? Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch is staying with him. She raised 4 boys of her own and she's steady. He'll be fine for a few days. But you won't be fine if you have to face this by yourself. Mara wanted to argue, but the relief that flooded through her was too strong. Thank you. The journey to Cheyenne took a full day. They traveled in companionable silence, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and stretch their legs. As the city came into view, larger and busier than Red Hollow by far, Mara felt her anxiety spike. I don't know if I can do this, she said quietly. Yes, you can, Silas said. You've already done harder things. You survived him leaving. You survived the town turning on you. You survived that hearing. This is just one more thing, and you won't be alone. They found lodging at a modest boarding house near the courthouse. The landlady showed them to separate rooms, and Mara was grateful for the privacy. She needed time to collect herself, to prepare mentally for what was coming. That night, she barely slept. She lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with memories she'd tried so hard to bury. Garrett's smile, his promises, the way he'd made her feel special, chosen, loved, and then the emptiness when he was gone, the shame that followed, the slow destruction of everything she'd thought she knew about herself. In the morning, Silas knocked on her door. Ready? Mara took a deep breath. As I'll ever be. The courthouse was an imposing brick building with tall windows and heavy wooden doors. Inside, it smelled of old paper and furniture polish. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Hartwell, met them in a side room and went over Mara's testimony one more time. He's going to try to make you look like you were willing, Miss Hartwell warned. Like you knew what you were getting into. Don't let him rattle you. Just tell the truth, clearly and calmly. The jury will see through his lies if you stay steady. Mara nodded, her hands clenched in her lap. The courtroom was packed. Mara walked in and felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She kept her gaze straight ahead, refusing to look at the faces in the gallery. And then she saw him. Garrett Hale sat at the defense table, looking exactly as she remembered, handsome, well-dressed, utterly composed. He glanced at her as she entered, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Assessment. Calculation. Mara lifted her chin and didn't look away. When her name was called, she walked to the witness stand with her head high. The prosecutor led her through her testimony with careful, methodical questions. Mara told her story simply and clearly. How they'd met, what he'd promised, how he'd convinced her to trust him, and how he'd disappeared without a word. She didn't embellish, she didn't dramatize, she just told the truth. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. He was a slick, well-fed man with cold eyes and a patronizing smile. Miss Quinn, he began, you say Mr. Hale made you promises, but isn't it true that you were eager for those promises? That you pursued him? No, Mara said firmly. He pursued me. And yet you accepted his attentions willingly, did you not? I accepted what I believed were honest intentions, yes. So you made a choice to trust him, to be intimate with him, to believe his words. Those were your choices, Miss Quinn. He lied to me, Mara said, her voice steady. He told me he loved me. He told me we would marry. He made promises he never intended to keep. How do you know he never intended to keep them? Perhaps circumstances changed. Perhaps he simply changed his mind. That's not a crime, Miss Quinn. Abandoning someone after making promises that destroy their life is a crime, Mara shot back. Or it should be. But you have no proof of his intentions, do you? Only your interpretation of his words. I have the fact that he did the same thing to at least 6 other women, Mara said. That's not coincidence.
That's a pattern. The defense attorney's smile tightened. We're here to discuss your case, Miss Quinn, not to speculate about others. Miss Hartwell stood. Your Honor, the pattern of behavior is directly relevant to establishing intent. The judge nodded. Sustained. Continue, Mr. Graves. The defense attorney circled back, trying to poke holes in her story, trying to make her seem unreliable or vindictive. But Mara held firm. She answered every question truthfully and calmly, refusing to be shaken. When he finally ran out of angles and dismissed her, she stepped down from the stand feeling drained but steady. Silas was waiting in the hallway. He pulled her into his arms without a word, and Mara let herself lean into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. You did it, he murmured into her hair. You were perfect. I just told the truth. That's all you needed to do. Over the next 2 days, other women testified. Each one told a similar story, promises made, trust given, lives destroyed. Some cried, some were angry, but all of them were brave. And by the time the prosecution rested its case, the jury looked grim. The verdict came quickly, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Garrett Hale to 15 years in prison for fraud, theft, and destruction of property, the closest legal charges they could bring for what he'd done. Mara sat in the courtroom and watched as they led him away in chains. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge any of the women whose lives he'd shattered. He just walked out with his head high, as if even now he believed he'd done nothing wrong. When the courtroom emptied, Mara stayed in her seat, staring at the empty space where he'd been. Silas sat beside her, waiting. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Mara considered the question. She'd expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, relieved, but what she felt was something quieter and deeper. Free, she said finally. I feel free. Silas took her hand. Good, because you are. They left Cheyenne the next morning and made the long journey home. The landscape rolled past, familiar and comforting. As they drew closer to the ranch, Mara felt something settle in her chest. This was where she belonged. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd chosen it, because she'd built something here that mattered. When they pulled into the yard, Eli came running from the house, Mrs. Patterson trailing behind him with a smile. He crashed into Mara's arms the moment she stepped down from the wagon. Missed you, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. I missed you too, sweetheart, Mara said, holding him tight. So much. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Silas and Mara sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. I've made my decision, Mara said quietly. Silas turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. About what I asked? Yes. Mara took a breath, her heart pounding. I want to stay, not just because I'm safe here or because I have nowhere else to go, but because I love this life. I love Eli, and She paused, gathering courage. I love you. Silas's breath caught. Mara, I know it's complicated, she continued. I know we've been through a lot. But when I was in that courtroom, facing down the man who tried to destroy me, all I could think about was coming home. To you, to Eli, to this. And I realized that this is where my heart is. This is my family. And I want to make it official, if you still want that. Silas reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his eyes bright with emotion. I've never wanted anything more. He kissed her then, soft and sure, and Mara felt the last pieces of her broken heart click into place. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. So that's a yes? Silas asked. That's a yes, Mara confirmed. They sat there holding each other as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the ruins. And for the first time in her life, Mara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning after their decision, Mara woke to find Silas already up, the smell of coffee drifting through the house. She dressed quickly and found him in the kitchen, standing at the window with a cup in his hand, watching the sun rise over the eastern fields. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and the look on his face made her heart skip. Morning, he said, his voice warm. Morning. Mara poured herself coffee and joined him at the window. You're up early. Couldn't sleep. He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his mouth. Kept thinking about what you said last night, making sure I didn't dream it.
You didn't dream it, Mara said softly. I meant every word. Silas set his cup down and turned to face her fully. Then we should do this right. Not just a quiet arrangement. A real wedding. Something that makes it clear to everyone that you're my wife and Eli's mother in every way that counts. Mara's throat tightened. Silas, we don't need anything fancy. I don't need the town's approval. This isn't about the town, Silas said firmly.
This is about you, about giving you the recognition you deserve, about standing in front of people and claiming you as mine without apology or hesitation. You've spent too long being treated like you don't matter. I want everyone to see that you do. Mara's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me do this for you, for us. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Silas pulled her into his arms and held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. From the doorway, a small voice said, Happy? They both turned to see Eli standing there in his nightshirt, his hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes curious. Mara laughed and held out her hand. Very happy, sweetheart. Come here. Eli patted over and let himself be pulled into the embrace. The three of them stood there in the quiet morning light, wrapped around each other, and Mara felt a peace so profound it almost hurt. The preparations for the wedding were simple but deliberate. Silas rode into town and made arrangements with the justice of the peace, a kind older man named Mr. Thornton who had always been fair in his dealings. Word spread quickly through Red Hollow, and the reactions were mixed. Some people were supportive, genuinely happy for Silas, and respectful toward Mara. Others were coldly disapproving, their silence speaking louder than words. But Silas didn't care, and neither did Mara. They were done seeking permission from people who had never offered kindness. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had watched Eli during the trial, proved to be an unexpected ally. She arrived at the ranch one afternoon with a carefully wrapped package. This was my daughter's, she said, handing it to Mara. She wore it at her wedding 5 years ago. She's out in California now with her husband, and she sent word that you're welcome to borrow it if you'd like. Mara unwrapped the package with trembling hands. Inside was a dress of soft cream muslin, simple but beautifully made, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was the loveliest thing Mara had ever seen. I can't accept this, she whispered. Of course you can, Mrs. Patterson said briskly. Every bride deserves something special, and you, my dear, have earned it 10 times over. Mara hugged the older woman fiercely, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Thank you for everything. You're a good woman, Mara Quinn, Mrs. Patterson said, patting her back. Don't let anyone tell you different. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with quiet preparation. Mara cleaned the house until it shone, baked bread and pies, mended every piece of clothing they owned. Silas worked on the ranch with renewed energy, fixing the broken step on the porch, repairing the gate that had been hanging crooked for months, whitewashing the fence. It was as if they were both trying to create something perfect, something worthy of the new beginning they were claiming. Eli watched it all with wide, observant eyes. One evening, as Mara was hemming the borrowed dress, he climbed into her lap and touched the fabric carefully. Pretty, he said. Thank you, sweetheart. You marry Papa. Mara's heart swelled. Yes. Is that okay with you? Eli thought about it seriously, his small face scrunched in concentration. Then he nodded. Good. Stay forever. Forever, Mara promised, kissing the top of his head. The wedding was set for a Saturday morning in early summer. The day dawned clear and bright, the sky a flawless blue, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Mara dressed in the borrowed gown, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the buttons. Mrs. Patterson had come early to help with her hair, pinning it up in a simple style and tucking a few small white flowers into the arrangement. You look beautiful, Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes bright with tears. Mara looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked strong. She looked hopeful. She looked like someone who belonged. The ceremony was held at the ranch under the big cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the yard. It was Silas's idea. He wanted to get married on their own land, in the place where they'd built their life together. A small group gathered. Mrs. Patterson and her husband, a few neighbors who had always been kind, and Mr. Thornton, the justice of the peace. Notably absent were the members of the committee, Mrs. Calloway, and anyone from the church. But Mara didn't mind. The people who mattered were there. Silas stood under the tree waiting for her, dressed in his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes fixed on the house. When Mara stepped out onto the porch, his expression transformed. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. Eli walked beside her, holding her hand tightly, his role as witness taken very seriously. When they reached Silas, he looked down at his son and said quietly, "Take care of her for me until I can say the words, okay?" Eli nodded solemnly and stood close to Mara, his small hand still clasped in hers. Mr. Thornton opened his book and began to speak. The words were traditional, familiar, but they felt new and profound in this context. When he asked if Silas took Mara to be his wife, Silas's voice was clear and unwavering. "I do." When it was Mara's turn, she looked into Silas's eyes and said the words with her whole heart. "I do." The ring Silas slipped onto her finger was simple, a plain gold band that had belonged to his mother, but it felt like a crown. When Mr. Thornton pronounced them married, Silas cupped Mara's face in his hands and kissed her softly, reverently, like she was something precious he'd been entrusted to protect. The small gathering applauded. Eli tugged on Silas's sleeve and said, "My turn." Silas laughed and lifted him up, and the three of them stood there together, a family made official by law, but bound together by something far stronger: love, loyalty, and the choice to keep choosing each other every single day. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a simple meal, and they all ate together under the cottonwood tree, the conversation easy and warm. Mara felt herself relaxing into the moment, soaking in the rare joy of being celebrated instead of judged. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the guests began to leave, she found herself alone with Silas and Eli in the yard, the three of them watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "Happy?" Silas asked, echoing Eli's question from days before. "More than I ever thought possible," Mara said honestly. That night, after they'd put Eli to bed, Silas took Mara's hand and led her outside. The stars were beginning to emerge, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds on velvet. They sat together on the porch steps, shoulders touching, fingers intertwined. "I need to tell you something," Silas said quietly. Mara turned to look at him, suddenly nervous. "What is it?" "When my wife died," Silas began, his voice rough with old grief, "I thought that was it. I thought I'd used up my chance at happiness, and all I had left was getting through each day for Eli's sake. I stopped hoping for anything more, stopped believing in second chances." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "And then you came here," he continued, broken and scared and determined not to show it. "And you didn't just survive, you fought. You stood up to people who tried to crush you. You loved my son when he needed it most. And somewhere along the way you made me believe again, not just in second chances, but in the possibility of something better than what I'd lost. You made me believe in us." Mara's vision blurred with tears. "Silas, I love you," he said simply. "I don't say it enough. I'm not good with words. But I need you to know that you're not just someone I married because it made sense or because Eli needs a mother. You're the woman I choose, every day, for the rest of my life." Mara leaned her forehead against his, her tears falling freely now. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Silas murmured. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. We're in this together." They sat there in the darkness, holding each other, and let the peace of that truth settle over them like a benediction. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Mara's life. She moved her belongings from the small storage room to the larger bedroom she now shared with Silas. It was a symbolic shift, but it felt monumental. She was no longer the hired help sleeping in the back of the house. She was the wife, the mother, the heart of the home. Eli thrived in the new atmosphere. His vocabulary expanded daily, his confidence growing with each successfully communicated thought. He started helping more around the ranch, following Silas to the barn and learning how to care for the horses, feed the chickens, mend simple tools. And every night, without fail, he would find Mara and press his forehead to hers, their ritual, their way of saying, "I see you, I love you, we're safe." One afternoon, about a month after the wedding, a wagon pulled into the yard. Mara was in the garden when she heard it, and she straightened slowly, shading her eyes against the sun. She didn't recognize the driver, but when a woman climbed down from the back, Mara's breath caught. It was one of the women from the trial. Sarah, who had testified about Garrett Hale's betrayal, who had sat in the courtroom with her head held high despite the defense attorney's attempts to shame her. Mara walked toward her slowly, uncertain. "Sarah?" The woman smiled, though it was tentative. "I hope you don't mind me coming. I got your address from the court records. I needed to thank you." "Thank me?" Mara repeated, confused. "For going first," Sarah said, "for standing up there and telling your story even though you knew what they'd try to do to you. It gave me the courage to do the same. And because you did, because we all did, he's locked away. He can't hurt anyone else." Mara's throat tightened. "You were brave too." "Maybe, but you were brave first." Sarah reached out and took Mara's hand. "I heard you got married, that you have a family now. I'm happy for you. You deserve every good thing." Mara squeezed her hand, overwhelmed. "So do you." They talked for a while longer, two women who had survived the same kind of betrayal, who had found the strength to fight back and reclaim their lives. When Sarah left, Mara stood in the yard watching the wagon disappear, feeling something shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And more than that, she had become someone who could help others thrive too. That night, she told Silas about the visit. "She came all this way just to thank you?" he asked, clearly moved. "She said I was brave first," Mara said quietly. "But I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Silas said. "It means doing the right thing even when you are. And you did that. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. That matters, Mara. More than you know." Summer deepened into early autumn. The days were still warm, but the nights grew cooler, carrying the first hints of the season to come. The harvest was good, the cattle healthy, the ranch thriving under Silas's steady management, and Mara's careful attention to every detail. They were building something solid, something that would last. One evening in late September, as they sat together after supper, Eli announced he wanted to show them something. He led them outside to the barn, where he'd been spending more and more time lately with Silas. Inside, laid out on a workbench, was a small wooden box he'd been carving with his father's help. "For you," he said to Mara, his voice shy but proud. Mara picked it up carefully. It was rough in places, the corners not quite even, but it had been made with such care and love that it was beautiful. On the lid, Eli had burned 3 simple figures with a hot poker, a man, a woman, and a child, holding hands. "Eli," Mara breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "This is perfect." "Family," Eli said, pointing to the figures. "Forever." Mara pulled him into her arms and held him tight. This boy, who had been so broken when she arrived, who had found his voice and his courage and his joy again. "Forever," she whispered. "I promise." Silas wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood there in the barn with the smell of hay and leather and earth surrounding them. 3 people who had found each other against all odds and built something unbreakable. Winter came gently that year, the first snow falling in delicate flakes that blanketed the ranch in white. Mara stood on the porch watching it fall, wrapped in a shawl Silas had bought her in town, and marveled at how different this winter felt from the last one. A year ago, she had been sleeping on the floor outside Eli's room, uncertain of her place, terrified of being sent away. Now she was standing in her own home, wearing a ring that proclaimed her belonging, loved and valued and safe. Silas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Cold?" "A little," Mara admitted, "but I don't mind." "What are you thinking about?" "How much has changed, how different everything is." "Better?" Silas asked quietly. "So much better." Mara leaned back against him. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for the other shoe to drop." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Silas said firmly. "We've fought too hard for this. We've earned it." Mara turned in his arms to face him. "I know. It's just hard to believe sometimes that I get to keep this, that I get to be this happy." Silas cupped her face in his hands, his eyes serious and tender. "You get to be happy, Mara, not because you earned it or deserved it or fought for it, though you did all those things, but because you're loved. And love doesn't keep score. It just is." Mara kissed him then, soft and deep, pouring everything she felt into that single gesture. When they pulled apart, she said, "I have something to tell you." Silas's expression shifted to concern. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Silas stared at her, his eyes widening, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. The biggest, most genuine smile Mara had ever seen. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Mara said, her own smile matching his. "I've known for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I said anything." Silas let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. When he set her down, his hands were shaking. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're having a baby." "We are. Eli's going to be a big brother." "He is." Silas pulled her close again, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I can't believe it. After everything, to have this too." "I know," Mara whispered. "It feels like a miracle." They told Eli at dinner that night. He listened carefully as they explained that there was going to be a new baby in the family, that he was going to be a big brother. His face went through several expressions: confusion, surprise, thoughtfulness, before settling on cautious excitement. "Baby?" he repeated. "Yes," Mara said. "A little brother or sister. Someone for you to help take care of." Eli thought about this seriously. Then he looked at Mara and said, "I help?" "Of course you'll help," Silas said. "You'll be the best big brother." Eli nodded, satisfied. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand on Mara's arm. "Safe," he said firmly. "Keep safe." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll all keep each other safe." That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Mara and Silas lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest, his hand resting on her stomach. "Are you scared?" Silas asked quietly. "A little," Mara admitted. "After everything that's happened, sometimes I'm afraid to be too happy, like it might get taken away." "It won't," Silas said with quiet certainty. "We won't let it. We've built something strong here, something that can withstand whatever comes." "I believe that," Mara said. "I do. It's just, I never thought I'd have this. A husband who loves me, a son who trusts me, a baby on the way, a home that's really mine. It feels almost too good to be real." "It's real," Silas assured her. "And it's yours, all of it, for as long as you want it." "Forever then," Mara said softly. "Forever," Silas agreed. The winter passed peacefully. Mara's belly began to swell, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing inside her. Eli was fascinated by the transformation, often pressing his ear to her stomach and listening for signs of movement. When the baby finally began to kick, his face lit up with wonder. "Strong," he declared, "like Mama." Silas spent his evenings working on a cradle, carving it from oak and sanding it until it was smooth as glass. He worked with meticulous care, each detail perfect, each joint secure. When it was finished, he presented it to Mara with quiet pride. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hand over the polished wood. "The baby's going to love it." "The baby's going to love you," Silas corrected. "The cradle is just furniture." Spring arrived with its usual fanfare of green shoots and birdsong and warming earth. Mara's due date drew closer, and the ranch prepared for the newest arrival. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to come stay when the time came, to help with the birth and to look after Eli during the crucial first days. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting. The baby came on a warm April morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern fields. The labor was hard, but not overly long, and when Mara finally held her daughter in her arms, small and red-faced and absolutely perfect, she wept with joy so pure it felt like being reborn. Silas sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, staring at the baby with an expression of awe. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mother." Eli was allowed in to meet his sister a few hours later. He approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide, and peered at the tiny bundle in Mara's arms. "Small," he observed. "Very small," Mara agreed. "Would you like to hold her?" Eli nodded, and Silas helped him settle into a chair before Mara carefully placed the baby in his arms. Eli stared down at his sister with intense concentration, his small face serious and protective. "Safe?" he asked, looking up at Mara. Safe, Mara confirmed. We'll all keep her safe. Together. Eli nodded and looked back down at the baby. Then very gently, he pressed his forehead to hers, the gesture he'd learned from Mara, the one that meant love and protection and belonging. Sister, he said softly. My sister. Mara looked at Silas, and they shared a moment of perfect understanding. This was their family, imperfect, hard-won, built from broken pieces and stubborn hope. But it was theirs, and it was whole. They named the baby Grace because that's what her arrival felt like. Unearned, undeserved, freely given grace that transformed everything it touched. The weeks after Grace's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings and the particular chaos that comes with a newborn. But through it all, Mara felt a contentment so deep it anchored her. She would stand at the window in the early morning light, Grace in her arms, and watch Silas and Eli working together in the yard, and think about how impossibly far she'd come. From the girl abandoned in Red Hollow to the woman standing here with a family she'd built from nothing. From someone the world had deemed worthless to someone who knew her own value. From broken to whole. One evening, when Grace was about 2 months old, the whole family sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Eli was on the steps playing with his wooden animals. Grace was asleep in Mara's arms, and Silas sat beside her with his hand resting on her knee. Do you ever think about him? Silas asked quietly. And Mara knew he meant Garrett. Sometimes, she admitted, but not the way I used to. I used to think about him and feel shame. Now I just feel nothing. He's locked away. He can't hurt anyone. And I'm here with everything he tried to take from me. Justice, Silas said. No, Mara corrected gently. Justice was the trial. This is something bigger. This is life. Real life. With people I love and who love me back. He took things from me, yes, but he couldn't take this. Because this isn't something you can steal or destroy. It's something you build day by day, choice by choice. Silas squeezed her knee. You're wise, you know that? Mara laughed softly. Not wise. Just someone who's learned some hard lessons. Then we're both students, Silas said. He looked out at the land stretching before them, the fields they'd worked, the home they'd built. I want you to know something, Mara. No matter what comes next, good years or bad, easy times or hard, I'm grateful. For you, for this, for second chances. Me too, Mara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Me too. Eli looked up from his toys and said, Story? It had become their evening ritual, Mara telling stories while the sun set and the stars emerged. She adjusted Grace in her arms and smiled at her son. What kind of story do you want tonight, sweetheart? Happy one, Eli said immediately. Then I'll tell you about a woman who thought she'd lost everything, Mara began, her voice soft and steady, but who found out that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning. That sometimes you have to fall apart completely before you can become who you were always meant to be. Eli climbed up onto the porch and settled beside her, his head resting against her arm. Silas wrapped his arm around all of them, and they sat there together as Mara wove her story, their story, into the gathering dusk. She told them about courage and kindness, about standing up when the world pushes you down, about the strength it takes to trust again after betrayal. She told them about families built not from blood, but from choice, about homes that are made from love rather than walls. And she told them that happy endings aren't given, they're fought for, day by day, with stubbornness and hope, and the refusal to give up even when everything seems impossible. When she finished, Eli was half asleep, his eyes heavy-lidded and peaceful. Grace had woken and was staring up at Mara with dark, curious eyes. Silas pressed a kiss to Mara's temple. Good story, he murmured. It's a true one, Mara said. The best ones always are. They stayed there on the porch as night fell completely, wrapped in each other's warmth, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own joys and sorrows. But tonight, they were together. Tonight, they were whole. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Years later, when people asked Mara about her life, she would smile and tell them it hadn't been easy, that she'd been knocked down more times than she could count, that she'd faced judgment and cruelty and loss. But she would also tell them that she'd learned something crucial in those dark days. That your past doesn't define your future unless you let it. That shame only has power if you accept it. And that sometimes the life you're meant to live only becomes possible after the life you planned falls apart. She would tell them about a ranch in the Montana Territory, about a widowed cowboy and his silent son, about a community that tried to break her and the family that made her whole. She would tell them about standing up in a crowded room and refusing to be diminished, about testifying in a courthouse and reclaiming her voice, about choosing love even when fear seemed safer. And she would tell them that she was grateful for all of it, the pain and the healing, the falling and the rising, the breaking and the becoming. Because every moment, good and bad, had led her here, to a life filled with purpose and love, to a family that chose her as fiercely as she chose them, to a sense of belonging that no one could ever take away. The story of Mara Quinn, now Mara Boone, wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real, messy and complicated and hard-won and absolutely, perfectly, beautifully real. And as she stood on that porch with her husband's arm around her shoulders and her children playing at her feet, watching another sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home.